Good morning. My name is Jenna Finch, and I am an assistant professor at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln in the Department of Psychology. I am so thrilled to present to you today on my dissertation entitled Executive Functions in Elementary School, Contextual Influences and Links to Adaptive Functioning, as part of the Paul R. Pintrich Outstanding Dissertation Award. I'm really honored to receive this award and get to give this presentation because Dr. Pintrich was such an inspiration to me, and I am still reading and citing his works today. So first, I will introduce to you a little bit of information on executive functions. Executive functions are children's abilities to regulate their attention and behaviors. Generally, there are thought to be three components to executive functions. The first is inhibitory control, and this is when children suppress impulsive thoughts or behaviors and resist distractions and temptations. This is probably what you're most familiar with when you think of executive functions and self-regulation. This is what you use when it's 11 p.m. and you've already eaten 3 cookies and you probably do not need to eat another one. You gotta, resist that temptation and suppress that instinct to go and just grab it off the counter. Next is working memory, or people's abilities to hold, update, and manipulate information in the mind. And this is what you use when you go to the grocery store but decided not to write down a list of what you needed for the dinners this week. And so you're trying to remember all of the recipes and all of the ingredients and which you have at home and what you still need to grab. Last is cognitive flexibility, or shifting attention or responses between competing rules or mental states. Anyone who is a parent during the current pandemic, you are using your cognitive flexibility all of the time to be able to respond to a few emails and then check out the Lego tower that your child has built and showed you. So these three components of executive functions are very, very crucial for children. And so next I'm going to discuss how in the classroom context these executive functions are in play. So here you see a picture of children in a kind of natural classroom context. In the front, we've got a group of children who are reading together from a book. And children have to use their executive functions to pay attention to the teacher or whomever is the reader and follow along. And to make sure that they're comprehending and understanding what they are reading and what questions the teacher is asking. And you can see that the children are doing this, with a variety of levels of success. And so we've got the second child from the left in blue. He's actually reading ahead, right? He's really into the story and he's kind of flipping through and reading the book on his own instead of following along. And then the sleepy kid on the far right, you can see that he's actually got his book closed, and so he has not been following along. My favorite kid is the one next to him, who is holding his head to really make sure that he focuses. And then also in this classroom, right in the middle at that green table, you'll see a child who is working independently, and that also requires executive functions, as that child is trying to keep track of the work that they are supposed to work on and make sure that they get it finished by the end of that time. On the far left at the blue table, you'll see 2 kids who are working together collaboratively on math problems. Executive functions also play a large role in being able to work and listen to your peers. So my first dissertation paper found that executive functions are indeed associated with multiple measures of children's adaptive classroom behaviors. So this includes task orientation, so focusing on the task at hand, children's assertiveness and leadership skills, their peer social skills, so how well they are getting along with their peers, their frustration tolerance when things tend to get difficult, and of course lower levels of acting out. So children with higher executive functions are much less likely to throw tantrums, to get upset, or to be aggressive in any way towards children. Now, I also found that over and above children's executive functions, their preference for more challenging things uniquely contributed to these adaptive classroom behaviors. And so what I learned from this first paper is that children really need 2 things. They need the ability to engage, and they need the motivation to do so. So just having the ability is not enough. They have to want it as well to engage appropriately in the classroom context. So not only are children's executive functions important for their classroom behaviors, but on top of that, children actually have the opportunity to build their executive functions when they are in school. And so what we know is that executive functions improve dramatically in the early school years. So this is due to two things. One, those brain areas, the prefrontal cortex is maturing during this time, but also children's experiences during the school year are influencing this. And you can imagine that the demands of formal schooling, not just the academic ones, but also the social ones, require children to engage their executive functions. So kids have to keep track of directions and their progress on their academic work. They need those executive functions to really understand more tricky academic material. Think about complex mathematical word problems where children have to keep track of multiple aspects of that problem and whether they should be using addition or subtraction. And then they also engage these executive function skills to manage their social interactions with peers. So the question is, are there benefits of school for these executive functions? Well, we know that academic skills grow more during the school year months compared to the summer months. And this is obvious. This is why we send children to school, right? It's set up directly to improve their academic skills. But it's not set up, the goal of schooling is not to improve children's executive functions. But indeed, we find from cutoff studies that being in more years of formal schooling is associated with more growth in executive functions. And so what they do is they compare the youngest, littlest kid in that kindergarten class to the kid who was just not quite old enough to go in, and they find that the kid who went to kindergarten versus the kid who did not, the one who was in kindergarten actually gained more executive functions over that school year. And so the research question for my second dissertation paper was, do growth rates in working memory skills, an aspect of executive function, differ between the school year and the summer months? I used a large nationally representative data set, the Early Childhood Longitudinal Study, and working memory was measured using the numbers reverse test. This is also known as the backward digit span. So essentially kids were given the numbers 6 to 5, and then they had to repeat back 5 to 6. This was a longitudinal study. And so I used data from the kindergarten, first grade, and second grade school years. And I used multi-level growth models, which built on the exact date of the assessments. And I'm not going to get into detail on the methods during this talk, but this paper is published, and so I'm happy to refer you there or answer questions on that. So here were the results. Just to orient you to this graph, what we see is first the kindergarten year, and then that kind of slimmer area is the summer after kindergarten, and then we have first grade, summer, and second grade. And when you're looking at this, the first thing you see is that the slopes of growth are steeper during the school year months compared to the summer months. So it goes up pretty steep during kindergarten, and then it kind of flattens out during that summer. And then next thing you'll see, if you actually look at the numbers, is that kids are gaining the most earlier in school. And so what we see is that children are gaining 2.775 points per month during that kindergarten year, but then by second grade, they're gaining almost a third of that. And it's the same for the summer. So children gain more during that first summer between kindergarten and first grade, and then less during the summer between first grade and second grade. And so what this is showing us is that, one, working memory does grow more during the school year months compared to the summer months. And so this suggests that something about the school activities are actually supporting this working memory development. similar to the ways in which kids gain more reading and math skills during the school year months than the summer months. And this is interesting because working memory is not part of the school curricula, and it is not a main goal of the school system. Now, why might this be happening? Well, classroom quality, we know, is associated with executive function development. And so maybe the types of activities that they are doing in that classroom are benefiting it. We also know that peer interactions can support executive function development. And finally, a lot of research is showing these bi-directional associations between executive functions and children's academic skills. And so during those school years, as kids really are gaining and improving in those academic skills, that's also probably benefiting their executive functions. But obviously, we can't take out of this analysis the mechanisms behind this, and so future research will really need to work on this. Now, the second question to this was around income-based disparities in executive functions. And so there's quite a lot of research at this point showing large income-based disparities in children's executive functions, even at kindergarten entry. And so using the same data set, they found that there is about a 1 standard deviation difference in working memory between children from the 1st and the 5th income quintile, so low income and high income children, right when they come into kindergarten. But there is some evidence that these gaps are closing in early elementary school years, which is very interesting. And so my question was, well, if schools are a place where kids are really learning and gaining these executive function skills, maybe schools are able to reduce income-based disparities in working memory skills. Or you could think that maybe schooling experiences, given that higher income children go to higher quality schools on average, might be actually exacerbating those income-based disparities. Well, here are the results. So if you look here in the red, those are children who are in the 10th income percentile. And then in the blue is the 50th, and then at the top there is the 90th. And as you can see all the way across, children with families who have higher levels of income, they are always going to have higher working memory skills. But if you actually look at that gap between the 10th and the 90th income percentiles at kindergarten, and then you drift your eyes over to the right, and you look at that in 2nd grade, it's gotten much smaller. And actually, it's gotten significantly smaller. So during kindergarten, the summer after kindergarten, and during that 1st grade year, we actually see income-based gaps in kids' executive functioning decreasing. But it's not just during the school year, it's also during the summer. So what does that tell us? Well, we see that low-income children's working memory skills are growing faster during kindergarten, the summer after kindergarten, and 1st grade, but schools do not seem to be playing a role in reducing or exacerbating these income-based EF gaps. Why is this? Well, this was shocking to me, and I think for a few reasons that we might be seeing these findings. So first, maybe the school experience, just going into kindergarten and starting that school experience, may spark a cascade of experiences that allow low-income children to practice and improve their working memory skills. So, for example, they start teaching children how to read, and suddenly, whether they're in school or out of school, they are able to build on and use those skills to learn a lot more about the world around them. And they also are exposed to a large variety of peers and expected to really regulate themselves during those interactions. And so children may be, both during the school year and during the summer, really building on those peer social skills. So my last dissertation paper is going to actually look at the role of peers in executive function development during the school year. So one thing we know is that as children go through those elementary school years and into middle childhood, they are expected and asked to manage their behavior and attention much more independently. And so the role of peers' executive functions may be particularly important during these middle childhood years. when interactions are less mediated by adults. And so you can imagine that having well-regulated peers might create classroom environments that are conducive to practicing self-regulation skills. So if your peers in your classroom are well-regulated, you're going to probably spend less time on unproductive tasks. And you may also be engaging in classroom tasks that foster self-regulation skills. The teachers will know that the students will be able to handle this, and they may give them more challenging skills that are really going to make them practice those executive functions. So the majority of the peer effects literature has focused on how average levels of academic skills in the classroom and behavior problems, and really that's around aggression, are linked to individual children's development. And generally what they find is that if kids are in classrooms where their peers have higher academic skills, they're more likely to gain academic skills over the year, and inversely, if they're in classrooms where children have more behavioral problems and are more aggressive, they are more likely to develop aggression over the year. There's just a small handful of papers that have looked at peer effects with executive functions, and these have all been in the early childhood years. And what they find is that higher mean levels of peers' executive functions might be positively associated with individual students' growth in executive functions and their vocabulary skills. And the studies that did find findings had very high coverage, meaning that they had many peers in the classroom involved in the study, not just 3 or 4 kids in each classroom. So the research question is, how do mean levels of classmates' executive functions link to growth in individual students' executive functions between the fall and spring of an academic school year? This study looked at 813 kids in 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade. It was a very diverse sample, both socioeconomically and racially and ethnically. And we did these very interesting group-based assessments of executive functions on 4 standardized tablet tasks. And so essentially all of the kids had tablets, and there was someone up in the front, and a research assistant, leading these group-based assessments. And the kids completed them all at the same time, very similar to how they would complete standardized tests. And we conducted these in both the fall and spring of an academic year. And from these tasks, we were able to measure children's accuracy, so how accurate they were on their responses, their reaction time, so how quickly they can respond on accurate trials, and their processing speed, which is just how quickly they respond in general on trials, not on ones that have any sort of EF component. And the main variable of interest is classmates' executive functions. And so we looked at the mean of peers' executive functions, and the amazing thing was that we were able to capture, on average, 90% of the students in each classroom. So here are our results. For accuracy, as you can see, if you look in that blue, we have no positive effects. And so it seems that the average accuracy of your peers on these EF tasks is not associated with students' growth in executive function skills. Now, however, when we look at reaction time as the outcome, we see that the classroom mean reaction time, so the average for your peers, is associated with growth in your own executive functions. And this holds true even when we control for kids' accuracy in the fall. So it's not based on how accurate they are. And even when we control for students' processing speed. So it's not about how quick they are to respond overall, but what it is really driven by is how well they are responding on those trials which require the EF skills. So what are some of the possible mechanisms? First, it could be peer interactions. So children who are in classrooms with higher average reaction times are more likely to interact with well-regulated peers. It might also be the teacher influences on peer interactions. So we know that individual relationships between teachers and students are actually able to shape peer interactions. And so that can then increase the opportunities for children's executive function development. And then finally, students' executive functions can elicit teachers' behaviors. So if they are in a classroom of students with high executive functions, they might design activities that are going to further benefit and draw on children's executive function skills. This journey would not be possible if not for many incredible people in my life. The first is Dr. Jenna. She was my graduate mentor and just an incredible person to work with and taught me everything I know. So thank you to Jenna. And everyone else in the Spark Lab at Stanford who helped with the data collection and were just wonderful peers and collaborators. Finally, I want to thank my ladder group at UNL. I have a most wonderful graduate student and lab manager and so many undergraduate students who just really make my job absolutely wonderful. So thank you so much for listening, and feel free to contact me with any questions, and we will also have a question session following this.